The afternoon light falls softly over St. Mary Mead. Kettles hum, curtains stir. Somewhere, a bell rings twice, then stops. Tell me, have you ever trusted what's written in a letter that wasn't meant for you? If not, pour yourself a cup and stay close, because tonight's story begins with ink, a secret, and a teapot that refused to stay silent. Now, let's open the lid. The morning settled over Street Mary Mead with quiet order. Shops opened. Curtains lifted. The milkman's cart rattled down the lane. A dog barked once. Then silence returned. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement arranged flowers. At the post office, Miss Hartnell argued about stamps. At Gossington Hall, the kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. It was midsummer, and in Mrs. Bantry's garden, chairs were being set for the annual tea gathering. The tablecloths were crisp, the cups spotless. By noon, half the village had arrived. Mrs. Bantry greeted each guest with her usual brightness. She smiled, too, quickly. Poured tea too fast. Her husband stood nearby, pretending not to notice. Mrs. Price Ridley took the first cup. "Such a lovely day," she said. Her tone made it sound like an accusation. She leaned toward Mrs. Bantry. "Poor Mr. Denham. Such a shock, wasn't it? Heart failure, they say." Mrs. Bantry nodded politely. "Indeed. Very sudden." "But sudden deaths," Mrs. Price Ridley whispered, "are rarely just that." She looked around as if the hedges might be listening. Miss Marple sat beneath the pear tree, a small basket of knitting on her lap. Her needles moved softly. Her eyes did not. From where she sat, she could see it all. Mrs. Price Ridley's tilt of the head, the flicker in Mrs. Bantry's hand, the silence that followed when someone said the word poison. Miss Marple said nothing. She never did at first. The air smelled faintly of roses and lemon polish. Somewhere, a bee buzzed near the jam tarts. The sound broke the tension for a moment, then faded. Mrs. Bantry poured again. "This year's tea feels different," said the vicar's wife. "Yes," said Mrs. Bantry quickly. "Perhaps the weather." It wasn't the weather. Everyone knew that. They just didn't know what else to call it. Then came the interruption. A maid in a plain apron hurried across the lawn. Her shoes left marks in the grass. She whispered something into Mrs. Bantry's ear. Mrs. Bantry froze. The color drained from her face. "My word," she said softly. The guests turned. "What is it, Dolly?" asked Miss Marple, voice gentle, unhurried. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. Her teapot steamed beside her hand. "She says," she began, "she found something this morning, while washing up." The group leaned closer. Mrs. Price Ridley's pearls shifted against her neck. "In the teapot?" someone asked. Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, a letter, damp, but legible, and—" She stopped, looked down, then whispered, "It's addressed to Mr. Denham." A short silence followed. Even the sparrows went quiet. Miss Marple reached for her cup. She didn't drink. Her gaze drifted toward the maid standing by the hedge. The girl's hands shook. Fear, not guilt. Miss Marple saw it at once. Something more than curiosity had brought her running. Something human, something hidden. She set her cup down slowly. Then, very quietly, Miss Marple looked up, eyes narrowing. The next morning came without surprise. No rain, no wind, just the same gentle hum of village life. But the tone had changed. At Mrs. Bantry's breakfast table, the conversation began early. The teapot sat between her and Mrs. Price Ridley. Neither reached for it. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to speak. "Well, Dolly, you can't expect to keep it quiet now. The whole village will know by noon." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "It was bound to spread, I suppose." Her spoon clinked against her saucer. "Elizabeth still, shaken, says she can't go near the kitchen." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. "Did you see it yourself? The letter?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "No, Colonel Melchett came last night and took it away. And it was addressed to Mr. Denham, wasn't it?" "Yes." "Then it's serious." Mrs. Price Ridley's voice dropped. I heard it was written in red ink. That can only mean blood. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Don't be ridiculous. But her eyes betrayed curiosity. It looked like ordinary ink, though I did notice. The envelope was torn on one side. Mrs. Price Ridley's fingers tightened around her cup. Torn or opened? Neither woman spoke for a moment. The ticking clock filled the silence. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window. She had been invited to breakfast out of politeness, but stayed out of interest. She watched the steam rise from her tea, listened to every pause, every sigh. Mrs. Price Ridley continued. Do you think it could be a confession? People do dreadful things when they're cornered. Mrs. Bantry shook her head again. No one in our village writes confessions, my dear. They just stop speaking to each other. That made Mrs. Price Ridley laugh, but her laughter ended too soon. She lowered her voice. You know, I always said Mr. Denham had that look, the kind that hides worry or guilt. Miss Marple spoke softly. I've always found, Mrs. Price Ridley, that guilt hides best in people who look most respectable. Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. Well, I never. But she smiled faintly, as if the remark pleased her. Mrs. Bantry poured another cup, careful not to spill. It's curious, though, she said. The teapot had already been rinsed the night before. Jenkins said so himself. Miss Marple looked up. Then the letter wasn't there when the tea was first poured. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. It appeared after Mr. Denham's death. Mrs. Price. Ridley leaned back. How dreadful. Imagine washing your dishes and finding that. Miss Marple didn't reply. She studied the steam rising between them, patterns shifting, then fading. People always left traces, she thought, sometimes in words, sometimes in what they chose not to say, and sometimes in something as ordinary as a teapot. Her needles moved again, quiet and steady. Human nature, she murmured almost to herself, never hides for long. It only waits to be noticed. The church bell rang at 9, slow, steady, clear in the morning air. Each note seemed to hang above the rooftops before fading into silence. Reverend Clement stood by the porch, brushing dust from his sleeves. He had heard the gossip already. Even a man of God was not spared it. Mrs. Clement came from the vestry, her hands full of hymn books. She looked tired. Everyone's talking, Leonard, she said quietly. About the letter. He sighed. Yes, I've heard. Mrs. Price. Ridley told me before breakfast, with great solemnity. She said it was written in red ink. Then we can be sure it was black, he said dryly. Mrs. Clement smiled faintly. You sound amused. I'm not, he said, but I've learned that in this village truth is always smaller than the story it becomes. They walked together toward the pews. The air smelled faintly of polish and candle wax. Light through the stained glass painted soft colors on the floor. Do you think there's any truth in it? She asked. That the letter was meant as a confession? He paused. It depends on who's confessing, the living or the dead. She looked at him sharply. You mean you believe there was wrongdoing? He didn't answer right away. I believe, he said at last, that guilt has a way of moving through a place, like smoke. You can't see where it starts, but everyone smells it. The door creaked. Miss Marple stepped in, quiet as a shadow, her hat slightly tilted, gloves in hand. Good morning, Reverend. Mrs. Clement. The vicar smiled gently. Ah, Miss Marple, you arrive just as the village mood darkens. It does seem unsettled, she said softly. I've never known a rumor to travel faster than a sermon. He chuckled. And both cause equal discomfort, I fear. She joined them near the front pew. I was curious, she said, about Mr. Denham's burial arrangements. The bell rang oddly last night. Yes, he said, 3 slow tolls. The verger claimed he heard it just after dusk. No one was near the ropes. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the tower. Then perhaps it wasn't the verger who heard wrong. Sometimes bells remember what men forget. The vicar watched her with mild surprise. You think the sound means something? Everything does, Reverend, she said. Even silence. He folded his hands. I hope this business ends quickly. The Village is restless. Fear breeds strange prayers. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And sometimes fear itself is a form of worship. The bell above gave a faint creak as the wind passed through the ropes. No one spoke for a moment. Then Reverend Clement said quietly, "Whatever that letter contains, Jane, I pray it brings the truth into light." She looked at him kindly. "Perhaps it already has, Reverend. Just not the way people expect." He gave a slow nod. "Confession," he murmured, "comes in many forms." The kitchen at Gossington Hall was quiet. Too quiet. Only the kettle hissed on the stove, and its sound filled the room like a whisper that refused to end. Elizabeth stood by the sink. Her hands trembled as she scrubbed the same cup again and again. Soap slid over porcelain, thin as nerves. Mrs. Broomley, the cook, watched her from the table. "Leave it, girl," she said. "You'll rub the glaze clean off." Elizabeth didn't answer. She glanced toward the teapot on the counter. It was spotless now, but she still looked at it as though it might speak. "You found it there, didn't you?" the cook pressed. "In the pot." Elizabeth nodded once. "It slipped when I lifted the lid. The paper was wet, folded small." Mrs. Broomley crossed herself. "Lord preserve us. I told Mrs. Bantry not to mix servants with their master's tea." Elizabeth kept scrubbing. Her voice dropped. It was warm. The cook frowned. "The pot?" Elizabeth nodded again. "I washed it hours after the funeral. No fire lit. Yet it was warm to the touch." She rubbed her hand over her apron, remembering. There was a mark, too, near the spout. "What sort of mark?" "Black. Like ink. Just a speck." Mrs. Broomley looked uneasy. "Ink doesn't belong near tea." "No," Elizabeth whispered, "but someone wanted it there." The kettle hissed louder, then quieted as the flame went low. The room felt smaller. "You should tell the police," said Mrs. Broomley. "They already took the letter. They'll be back for more." Elizabeth shook her head. "They think I'm frightened." "Aren't you?" She hesitated. "I'm not frightened of what's written. I'm frightened of who knew where to hide it." Mrs. Broomley folded her arms. "Then stop staring at that pot. It's only clay." Elizabeth looked down. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished lid. "Clay," she said softly, "remembers the heat that touched it, even after the fire's gone." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Firm, slow, male. Elizabeth turned sharply, hands wet. Inspector Slack entered. He nodded once. "Miss Elizabeth." "Sir, Colonel Melchett says you found the letter. You didn't read it, I hope?" "No, sir. I only saw the name." He studied her face. "Denham." She nodded. "Strange place to find a letter," he said. Elizabeth's voice broke slightly. "People hide truth where it feels safe, sir." He paused, then left without reply. The kettle began to hiss again, softer this time, like a breath through teeth. Elizabeth dried her hands, eyes fixed on the teapot. Upstairs, a clock struck 10. She whispered under her breath. It was still warm. And for the first time, she wondered whose hands had kept it that way. By noon, the village was awake with talk. The air buzzed like a kettle just before the boil. Every doorway seemed to hold a whisper. At the drapery shop, Mrs. Hartnell spoke in a low voice. "They say the letter was written in blood." Her customer leaned closer. "Blood? I heard it was typed. Signed, too." "With what name?" "Only initials. E.D." They both fell silent, glancing toward the street. Outside, Mr. Larkin, the gardener, stood by the cart. He pretended to adjust the harness, but listened to every word. When they left, he turned to Miss Conway from the post office. "You handle the letters," he said. "Did Denham post anything strange?" She frowned. "Not lately, but someone came for a parcel last week. Didn't sign their name right." He nodded, thoughtful. Maybe they didn't want to. Across the lane, the butcher's wife joined in. "I heard Mrs. Bantry fainted when she saw the handwriting." "Fainted?" said Miss Conway. "That's what Elizabeth told the milkman." "And the milkman told everyone," added Larkin. They laughed, but none of them looked amused. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Children ran past with paper bags, unaware of the tension around them. Gossip wrapped the whole street like fog. Miss Marple walked slowly along the pavement, basket on her arm. She stopped at each shop, buying little, listening much. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every whisper reached her before the next sentence began. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was in fine voice. "Mark my words, Jane," she said loudly. It was a woman's hand. "You can tell by the loops. A man would never write like that." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Perhaps," she said, "though men have been known to imitate women, especially when it serves a purpose." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Well, that's a dark thought. Human nature often is," Miss Marple said softly. A bicycle bell rang. The postboy passed, scattering dust from the road. In his basket sat a single envelope, the ink still damp. Miss Marple's eyes followed it. People could not stop sending messages, she thought, even when silence would serve them better. At the corner, she paused by the church wall. The sun was lowering now, warm on the stones. She heard the faint echo of voices from the bakery, then from the pub. Same words, same guesses, slightly changed each time. Truth, she thought, was like a coin tossed between hands. It shone in the passing, but no one kept it long enough to see. Both sides. She turned toward home, her basket light, her mind busy. The cobblestones clicked beneath her shoes. Behind her, the village still murmured. And as she reached the gate, she said quietly to herself, "Rumors travel faster than reason, but reason always catches up." The afternoon sun fell weak through the curtains at Gossington Hall. The housekeeper had polished everything twice. Even the silence looked tidy. Miss Marple arrived just after 3. Her knock was soft. The door opened at once. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with visible relief. "Oh, Jane, thank goodness you've come. This whole business, it's dreadful." "I thought a little conversation might help," said Miss Marple. Her tone was calm, almost kind. They walked toward the drawing-room. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old flowers. Cups waited on a tray, untouched. Mrs. Bantry began at once. "Melket was here again this morning. Took the teapot away. Asked half a dozen. Questions I couldn't answer. I feel like a criminal in my own home." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I doubt he suspects you, my dear. You're far too generous for guilt." Mrs. Bantry sat, twisting a napkin. "Elizabeth keeps crying. Says she can't sleep. The poor thing swears she washed that pot clean before bed." "Did she?" asked Miss Marple. "That's what she insists." "And Jenkins? Carried the tray as usual, I imagine." "He always does." Miss Marple's eyes moved to the table. "Then he was the last to handle it before the girl." Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Perhaps. But he's been with us 20 years. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Loyalty can be such a delicate thing. It changes shape when it feels ignored." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Jane, you don't think—" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that people often reveal themselves through small habits. Tell me, did Mr. Denham pour his own tea that evening?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "He did. I remember he said the second cup always tastes better." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the empty saucer beside the tray. A faint ring of colour stained the rim brown at first glance, but not tea. She touched it lightly. The mark smudged. "Curious," she murmured. "Tea leaves don't stain like this. Ink does." "Mrs." Bantry leaned forward. "Ink? But why would there be ink in a teapot?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is a very good question." She straightened, eyes thoughtful. "Did anyone notice the time when Elizabeth found the letter?" "Just after breakfast, I think. Before 9. Miss Marple nodded. "Strange, because the pot was still warm." "Mrs.?" Bantry looked puzzled. Meaning, Miss Marple said quietly. "Someone reheated it after the house had gone cold. But only for a moment. The house fell still again. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her gloves. The heat tells its own story, Dolly. Not when, but how quickly. Mrs. Bantry stared at her. Quickly? Yes, said Miss Marple, walking toward the door. Timing, my dear, is always the real clue. The vicarage smelled faintly of toast and furniture polish. Miss Marple was shown in by Mrs. Clement, who smiled, though her eyes looked worried. Such dreadful talk, Jane, she said softly. Leonard hasn't had a quiet moment since breakfast. Everyone wants his opinion. Miss Marple removed her gloves. People always want guidance when they already have their minds made up, she said gently. They stepped into the sitting room. The Reverend stood by the window, cup in hand. Ah, Miss Marple, he said. You arrive just as I've been praying for calm. I fear it may be a long time coming. She sat down. You've heard the latest, I suppose. He nodded. The letter. Melchett told me last night. He believes it was written by Denham himself. Mrs. Clement frowned. But that can't be right. Mr. Denham never kept ink in the house. He always wrote his letters at the library. The Reverend looked surprised. My dear, how do you know that? You told me so yourself last week. You said he was very particular about blotting paper. He hesitated. Did I? Miss Marple glanced between them. The small contradiction hung in the air like smoke. You visited him recently, Reverend? She asked. Only once. To speak about the church fund. He seemed distracted. Did he mention any debts? None. But he asked strange questions. About forgiveness. And timing. Timing? Miss Marple repeated. Yes. He said some sins wait for the proper hour before they show themselves. Mrs. Clement sighed. I told you he wasn't well. The heart makes people morbid. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps, but a troubled mind often remembers more clearly than a calm one. The clock ticked, steadily on the mantelpiece. A draught stirred the curtains. The vicar turned away from the window. It's all rather sad, he said. He died alone. And now the village will make stories to fill the silence. Miss Marple lifted her cup. Stories, she said quietly, are what people create when truth feels too small. Mrs. Clement looked uneasy. Jane, you don't think this will lead to trouble? I think, Miss Marple said, that trouble has already chosen its path. We're only following behind. The kettle hissed in the adjoining room. For a moment, the three of them listened to it without speaking. Then Miss Marple asked softly, Did either of you happen to notice when the church bell rang last night? The Reverend blinked. Just after 9, I think. Mrs. Clement frowned. No, dear. It was nearer 10. I remember because I had just finished the washing. The Reverend turned slowly toward her. Are you certain? Quite. Miss Marple set down her cup. Her eyes stayed on the steam still rising from it. Someone, she thought, had lied, but not who everyone believed. By the time Inspector Graves reached Street, Mary Mead, the village had already decided who was guilty. He stepped out of the motor car, straightened his coat, and looked around as if the hedges themselves might be listening. The air smelled faintly of damp grass and soaped the ordinary scent of places that hid extraordinary things. Mrs. Bantry met him at the door. Inspector, you'll find everything as it was, she said quickly. Except the nerves, of course. Those are quite undone. Graves nodded. I'll try not to disturb them further, madam. May I see the maid? Elizabeth stood by the doorway, wringing her hands. She curtsied, eyes down. He spoke gently, but without warmth. You're the one who found the letter. Yes, sir. You read it? No, sir. Just the name. Mr. Denham's? Yes, sir. He wrote something in his notebook. How long had the teapot been washed before you found it? I don't know, sir. I thought it was done the night before. But it was warm? Yes, sir. Any idea why? No, sir. He looked up sharply. Think carefully. No one touched it? She hesitated. Not that I saw. Graves shut the notebook. People rarely see what matters most, he said. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly near the window, finally spoke. That is very true, Inspector. though sometimes they see more than they realize. He gave a polite nod. Ah, Miss Marple, I've heard of your interests. I prefer the term observations, she replied calmly. Observations have the advantage of being less emotional than conclusions. Graves smiled faintly. Quite so. Still, conclusions are what solve cases. Sometimes, she said. Other times, they end them too soon. He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the teapot from the table where it had been returned. Strange place to hide a letter, he murmured. Very, said Miss Marple, unless the person who hid it wanted to ensure it was found by someone harmless. Harmless? Yes. A maid washing dishes is rarely suspected of anything more than gossip. He studied her face. You think it was planted? I think it wanted to be discovered, she said softly. Graves closed the teapot lid. Well, we'll know soon enough. Handwriting tests are being done. Then we'll all feel clever, won't we? He frowned slightly. Meaning? Meaning, she said, that men like proof. Women prefer patterns. Graves slipped his notebook back into his pocket. I deal in facts, Miss Marple. Indeed, she said, standing. And yet facts never argue as neatly as men do. He opened his mouth to reply, but she was already moving toward the door. The clock struck 4. The sound filled the room with a strange finality. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the hedge. She smiled faintly to herself. Men's logic, she murmured, is tidy until it meets the truth. The afternoon light slanted through the parlor curtains at the Denham house. Dust floated in thin ribbons across the air. Inspector Graves sat at the small writing desk, notebook open. Opposite him, Clara Denham, niece of the late Mr. Denham, sat upright, pale but composed. Miss Marple was present too, quietly knitting by the window. Her needles clicked softly, steady as a metronome. Graves began simply. You were close to your uncle, Miss Denham? Yes, she said. Very close? Her voice tightened. He raised me since I was 15, after father died. He nodded. Kind of him. Yes, he could be strict but kind. He wanted the best for me. Graves flipped a page. Did you depend on him financially? I lived here. Of course he provided for me. And in his will? She hesitated. I don't know the details. The solicitor hasn't read it yet. Graves leaned back. Still, you must have some idea. She looked away. I expect a small allowance, nothing extravagant. Miss Marple spoke gently. I imagine your uncle was cautious with money. Clara nodded. Very. Every penny accounted for. Even his ink bottles were locked in a drawer. Graves looked up. Locked? Yes. He said ink was as dangerous as words. Miss Marple paused her knitting. Curious expression. He meant, Clara said, that once you write something, you can't take it back. The inspector's tone softened. When did you last see him? The evening before he died. We had tea together. And after? I went out. To the vicarage. Choir practice. Anyone see you? Mrs. Clement did, I think. He made a note. Did your uncle seem unwell? No. Just distracted. He asked. About my engagement. Miss Marple looked up. Engagement? Clara blushed slightly. To Henry Blake, the solicitor's clerk. Uncle disapproved. Said Henry was impatient. And poor. Graves nodded. Did you quarrel? No, not really. But he said something strange. About timing. Miss Marple set her knitting down. Timing again, she said softly. Yes, Clara said. He told me some fortunes arrive too soon to be blessings. I didn't understand. Graves watched her closely. Did you touch the teapot that evening? She blinked. No. Elizabeth brought it after dinner. I only poured. Miss Marple studied her hands. There was faint discoloration on one finger, a smudge of dark blue. Do you write letters, my dear? She asked quietly. Clara hesitated. Sometimes. With ink? Clara looked down. Yes. Last night. I wrote to Henry. Miss Marple's voice was kind. Love letters often reveal more than they intend. Clara's eyes filled. I didn't kill him, she whispered. No one said you did, Miss Marple replied. But people who fear being blamed sometimes forget what they fear most, truth itself. Graves closed his notebook. That will be all for now, Miss Denham. When she left the room, Miss Marple stared after her. She touched the faint ink mark on her own glove. Thoughtful. Fear, she murmured. Or guilt. Which stains deeper? The Denham house had never looked so clean. Not since Mr. Denham's death. Every surface gleamed. Every cushion sat perfectly straight. It was the kind of tidiness that made Miss Marple uneasy. She arrived under the excuse of visiting Clara, but it wasn't Clara she wanted to see. It was the room itself. The maid opened the door, quiet as a mouse. This way, ma'am, she said softly. Miss Marple nodded, stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender oil and starch. The sitting room looked too arranged. Books stacked by height, not subject. The inkstand perfectly centered on the desk. Even the rug corner had been pressed flat. Clara entered moments later. I was just finishing the dusting, she said quickly. I find it helps me think. Miss Marple smiled kindly. An orderly room brings orderly thoughts, my dear. Her eyes moved slowly across the furniture. But sometimes, she added, it hides disorder just beneath the polish. Clara frowned. I don't understand. Miss Marple gestured to the writing desk. Your uncle's pen was always on the left side, wasn't it? Yes, and now it's on the right. Clara glanced down. I must have moved it while cleaning. Of course, but you also moved the blotter, didn't you? Clara hesitated. Yes, perhaps. Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle. It's curious, though. The ink marks run the other way now, left to right, instead of right to left. Clara said, nothing. Her fingers twisted the corner of her apron. Miss Marple walked toward the mantel. A framed photograph sat there, Mr. Denham, stern-faced, holding a walking stick. His reflection glimmered faintly in the glass. Your uncle was right-handed, wasn't he? Yes. Then he wouldn't have placed his pen there, nor written from that angle. Clara's breath caught. I don't see what you mean. Miss Marple turned back to the desk. She lifted the ink bottle carefully. It was almost full, too full for a man who supposedly wrote a long letter. She set it down again. When people tidy a house after tragedy, she said softly, they rarely think of small details. Yet small details often tell the truth. Clara's face paled. You think the letter was false? I think, Miss Marple replied. The letter was written by someone who knew the desk, but not the hand. Clara sank into a chair. But why forge it? Perhaps to prove a point, or to bury one. The clock ticked between them. Outside, a sparrow fluttered against the window and flew away. Miss Marple looked around one last time. The dust had no pattern. The air held no warmth. Too perfect, too arranged. Tidy, she murmured almost to herself, means someone rearranged truth. Her eyes returned to the inkstand. The seal beside it was smudged, just enough to show it had been pressed twice. Miss Marple folded her gloves slowly. Forgery, she whispered. Neat work, but careless with timing. The butler, Jenkins, stood stiffly in the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoes polished enough to catch the afternoon light. Miss Marple watched him quietly before speaking. You've been with the Denham family many years, she said. 32, ma'am, he replied. His voice was flat, but there was pride beneath it. Then you must have known Mr. Denham rather well. I did. He was a fair man. Particular, but fair. Miss Marple nodded. And fond of his niece. She was the only one left to him. Of course he cared. The maid, Elizabeth, stood nearby, head bowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a tray of tea. The faint hiss from the kettle in the adjoining room filled the pauses. Jenkins, Miss Marple said, you prepared the tray the night before the funeral, didn't you? Yes, ma'am. Same as always. And the teapot? Cleaned and set on the tray. No letter in it then? None, ma'am. Miss Marple's tone stayed mild. So when did it appear? He hesitated. Couldn't say exactly. I took the tray to the kitchen early that morning. Elizabeth washed it later. She turned to the girl. Did he come back after? Elizabeth shook her head quickly. No, ma'am. He went straight to the pantry. Jenkins looked uneasy. I did, yes, but only to fetch the sugar tin. Mrs. Bantry was particular about the tea. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Sugar tin. That's in the same cupboard as the teapot shelf, isn't it? Yes, ma'am. And you opened it? I did. Then you might have noticed the teapot had been moved. He frowned. I didn't, ma'am. I wasn't looking for that. Elizabeth spoke suddenly. He didn't want anyone near that cupboard after. Said the inspector told him not to touch a thing. Jenkins' tone sharpened. I was following orders, girl. Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. Yes, orders can be very persuasive. He looked at her then just a moment too long. Something flickered in his face. Regret, perhaps, or fear. I served Mr. Denham all my life, he said quietly. I wasn't about to see his name dragged through the papers. He wasn't a bad man, only lonely. Miss Marple folded her hands. And that, Jenkins, is what makes people careless. Not wickedness, loneliness. He straightened. Again. I'd have done anything to protect him. Even after he was gone? She asked softly. He didn't answer. The ticking clock filled the silence. The smell of tea drifted through the doorway. Miss Marple rose. Loyalty, she said slowly, is a fine thing when it keeps truth safe. She turned toward the window. But when it keeps lies alive, it becomes something else. Jenkins bowed his head. Ma'am, I only did my duty. Miss Marple looked at him gently. Duty, she said. Another dangerous word. The church was empty that evening. Candles unlit, air still. The faint smell of wax and wood polish lingered in the pews. Reverend Clement sat alone in the front row, his hat resting beside him. Miss Marple entered quietly. Her footsteps made no sound against the stone floor. You're working late, Leonard, she said softly. He looked up, startled. Ah, Miss Marple, not working, thinking. That can be heavier labor, she said, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. It is tonight. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the clock from the vestry ticked faintly. He folded his hands. You've heard the talk, of course, he said. About the letter, about Jenkins, about poor Clara. Yes, she said quietly. And about you, Leonard. He turned sharply. About me. People notice when a man of God visits the house of the dead twice in 1 week. He sighed. I went to comfort the niece. Nothing improper. I know that, said Miss Marple, but people prefer suspicion to understanding. He leaned back, eyes closed. I wonder if they're right to. Miss Marple watched him carefully. There's something troubling you, she said. He nodded slowly. Something from long before this. He clasped his hands tighter. Years ago, I advised Mr. Denham against a marriage. He loved a young woman from the next parish. I told him she was unsuitable. And was she? She later married another man, one who ruined her. She died not long after. He never forgave me. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Perhaps he blamed God when he meant to blame you. Perhaps, said the vicar. Last week he came to see me. He said he was writing a letter. A confession, he called it. He wanted me to keep it sealed until after his death. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And did you? He hesitated. I refused. I told him a man's soul can't be saved through ink and envelopes. So he left angry? Yes, but not angry enough to hate me, or so I thought. She studied his face. You think the letter found in the teapot was that same confession? I fear it was a copy or worse, a forgery written in his name to expose me. Expose you? He lowered his voice. There was money involved. The church roof fund. Denham contributed a large sum years ago, then withdrew it suddenly. Said I'd mishandled it. And did you? No. But he claimed he had proof. Proof kept where? In a sealed envelope, he said. Somewhere safe. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. Perhaps that envelope was meant for you all along. He looked at her sharply. You mean blackmail? I mean, she said softly, that confessions written too late often serve the living more than the dead. The church bell creaked in the tower above them. A faint wind stirred the hymn sheets on the lectern. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Fear hides in piety as easily as in crime, she said. He nodded slowly. And now, she murmured, we must find who used that fear for profit. Her eyes lingered on the darkened pulpit. Blackmail, she whispered. The quiet sin that never prays. The second death came quietly. No warning, no cry, just the sound of porcelain breaking. It happened at Gossington Hall, evening light fading. Supper, half served. Jenkins carried the soup tray into the dining room. Then, suddenly, he dropped it. The tureen crashed. The ladle rolled across the carpet. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Jenkins, what on earth? He didn't answer. He took one step forward, then another. His face turned grey. He gripped the chair back, then folded to the floor. The maid screamed. The sound echoed through the hall. Dr. Haydock was sent for at once. He arrived within 10 minutes. The smell of spilled soup still hung in the air. Dead, he said quietly. Heart failure, perhaps, or poison. He couldn't be sure. Miss Marple stood at the doorway. Her eyes moved over the tray, the broken china, the untouched glass of wine. Was he ill before? She asked softly. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. He was nervous, yes, but not sick. He had tea not an hour ago. Miss Marple turned to the doctor. Could tea cause this? Not unless it was tampered with, he said. She looked down at Jenkins' hands. One palm was smudged with something dark, not ink ash, a faint trace of burnt paper. She spoke quietly. He burned something. Dr. Haydock nodded. Maybe a letter. Miss Marple's tone was calm. Then it wasn't his heart that failed him, Doctor. It was his courage. He looked at her sharply. You think suicide? No, she said. I think silence killed him. The room fell still again. Mrs. Bantry's voice broke the pause. What do you mean, Jane? Miss Marple stepped closer to the hearth. Ashes glowed faintly beneath the grate. A corner of white paper survived the fire. She reached for the poker and lifted it out. 3 letters were visible, E.D. A. Dr. Haydock exhaled. Denham. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He burned what he couldn't explain. The inspector arrived soon after. He took notes, asked questions, filled the silence with authority. Miss Marple stayed by the fire, her face unreadable. When he finished, she said quietly, It's never the first death that shocks me, Inspector. He frowned. No? No, she said. The first is often a mistake. The second is fear trying to erase it. He studied her for a moment. You think Jenkins was covering for someone? I think he was covering something that refused to stay buried. She looked again at the ashes. The faint smell of smoke clung to the air. People burn evidence, she said softly, but never guilt. That always survives the flame. Outside, the evening bell began to toll, low, uneven, as if the church itself mourned too soon. Miss Marple turned from the fire. Her eyes lingered on the empty chair beside the door. Now, she murmured, we'll see who fears the silence most. The morning after Jenkins's death, the village felt heavier. The fog hung low across the green. Every window seemed half open, as if waiting for an explanation. Miss Marple walked to the post. Office. The bell above the door rang once, sharp against the quiet. Inside, Miss Conway stood behind the counter, sorting envelopes. Good morning, Miss Marple, she said. Terrible about the butler. People are saying it's a curse. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curses are only useful when guilt has no name. The postmistress leaned closer. I suppose you'll want to see this. She opened a drawer and took out a small torn scrap of paper. Found it under the mat this morning. Looks like it's been through fire. Miss Marple took it carefully. The edges were blackened. A faint smell of smoke clung to it. Across the corner, A few words survived. Roof fund. Proof enclosed. Proof, Miss Marple murmured. The word matched what the vicar had said the night before. She folded the fragment and slipped it into her glove. Outside, the air was crisp. The church bell sounded once, echoing through the lane. She began her walk toward the vicarage. On the way, she met Mrs. Price Ridley. The woman stopped at once. "They say Jenkins confessed before he died." "To whom?" asked Miss Marple. "No one knows. But Mrs. Bantry swears he mentioned the vicar's name." "Did she hear it herself?" "No. Elizabeth told her." "And who told Elizabeth?" Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. "Well, I suppose Jenkins." Miss Marple's smile barely moved. "Then the dead have become excellent conversationalists." She continued down the lane, her thoughts turning. Rumour, she thought, had become a currency everyone spent freely, each coin duller than the last. At the church gate she paused, the fragment in her glove pressed against her palm. Roof fund. Proof enclosed. Jenkins burned something. The vicar feared exposure, and Denham dead before his confession reached anyone. She stopped walking. The pattern clicked quietly into place. Not who, but when. Someone had written the letter after Denham's death, to use his voice. A robin hopped across the path. Its chirp broke the silence, sharp and ordinary. Miss Marple looked up at the bell tower. Timing. Again. Always timing. She turned toward the rectory, her steps even, her expression calm. If she was right, one person in Street Mary Mead had tried to mend a sin with another. Not out of greed this time, but loyalty twisted into fear. At the door of the vicarage she paused once more. The fog lifted slightly, her eyes sharpened. "It's time to stop listening," she said softly. "Now I ask." She adjusted her gloves and knocked twice. This visit, she thought, would not be polite. It would be final. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall felt heavier than usual. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The table was laid for tea, 4 cups, 4 saucers, 1 untouched slice of sponge. Miss Marple sat at the head, calm and composed. To her left, Clara Denham. Opposite her, Reverend Clement and Mrs. Bantry. Inspector Graves stood by the mantel, silent for once. Mrs. Bantry poured tea with a trembling hand. "It feels odd, Jane," she whispered. "Having tea when there's been all this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Tea helps, my dear. It gives people something to hold when they cannot hold the truth." No one spoke for a moment. Only the quiet hiss of the rain filled the room. Miss Marple began gently. "We've all lost someone. Mr. Denham. Then, poor Jenkins. But grief and guilt often take the same shape, don't they?" Clara flinched. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Bantry's spoon rattled in her cup. The inspector finally spoke. "If you've called us here, Miss Marple, I assume you've found something." "I have," she said. She reached into her handbag and placed a small burnt scrap on the table. The words were faint, half lost. Roof fund. Proof enclosed. The Reverend's face went pale. He recognized the phrase. Miss Marple saw it at once. "This was found under the post office mat," she said, meaning it was meant to be sent or hidden. Clara's voice trembled. "What does it prove?" "That Mr. Denham wrote 2 letters," Miss Marple said softly. "One for the church, and one to expose whoever forged the first." The Reverend's hand gripped the edge of the table. "I told him to destroy it," he said quietly. "He refused." Miss Marple nodded. "And when Jenkins found it, he burned it instead. Out of loyalty. Not for you, Reverend, but for Clara." Clara stared at her, speechless. "For me?" "Yes. He thought you'd written the forgery. To protect your engagement. To clear your uncle's debt from gossip. He wanted to save you from scandal." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "I didn't." Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "No, my dear, you didn't. But someone wanted it to look that way." She turned toward the vicar. "Your conscience, Leonard, is a kind one. But sometimes kindness blurs the line between help and harm." The room grew still. The inspector stepped forward. "Are you accusing the Reverend?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I'm saying truth was shared among too many careful hands, and one of them pressed too hard. Rain struck the window harder now. A small draught lifted the edge of the burnt paper. Miss Marple's eyes followed it. Loyalty, she said softly, turns cruel when it tries to tidy guilt. No one answered. Only the steady drip from the eaves broke the silence. Miss Marple folded her gloves. Her voice was calm. The truth, she said, is almost ready to speak for itself. The house was quiet again. Only the clock ticked in the hall. The others had gone, leaving Miss Marple and Reverend Clement alone in the drawing-room. The rain had stopped. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and extinguished candles. The vicar sat motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple poured the last of the tea. "Sugar?" she asked, gently. He shook his head. She waited. She always did. Finally he spoke. "You were right, Miss Marple." His voice was low, too calm. "Jenkins didn't act alone." She nodded once. "I thought as much." He looked up. There was another letter. "I wrote it." Her hands stilled on the teapot. "Go on." "I found Denham's confession after his death. It accused me of theft, said I'd misused the roof fund." "And had you?" "No," he said quickly. "Not theft, but I borrowed from it once, temporarily, to help a parish family. I meant to repay it, and I did. But the record, it looked bad." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "So, you forged the letter to cover it?" He nodded. "I wanted to quiet the talk. I copied his handwriting. Jenkins saw me. He swore he'd never tell. I told him it was for the church's good." Her tone remained gentle. "And after he burned the original? He thought he was protecting me. He didn't know I'd already betrayed him by letting him take the blame." The clock ticked again, a soft, steady rhythm. She let the silence rest. He went on, voice trembling now. "I never meant for him to die. He came to me that night, said he'd burned the wrong paper, said the truth would come out anyway. I tried to calm him. He drank from his cup before I realized the tea was still warm from the kettle. I'd poured it fresh, too soon." Miss Marple looked down. "Poison?" He shook his head. "No, fear. He saw my face, and it frightened him. He thought I'd come to accuse him. His heart stopped before I spoke another word." She folded her hands. "People rarely die from what we say, Reverend. It's what they believe we're about to say that finishes them." He leaned back, eyes closed. "I wanted to confess, but I feared what it would do to my wife, to the church." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost kind. "Fear makes people tidy up what should be left messy. Every crime begins in fear, Leonard." He nodded slowly. "She'll be heartbroken. She'll forgive," said Miss Marple. "Forgiveness comes easily to those who already live with guilt." He looked at her with quiet gratitude. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," she said simply. "But not all at once. Truth, like tea, must be poured slowly or it burns." She rose, adjusted her hat, and glanced toward the dark window. Somewhere outside, a single bird called in the quiet. Miss Marple turned to leave. The truth had spoken. But not everyone, she knew, was ready to hear it yet. The rain returned before dawn. Light, steady, unhurried. It tapped against the vicarage windows like a reminder that nothing ever truly stops, only softens. By morning, Inspector Graves had done what he must. There was no scene, no shouting, only a quiet knock, a brief conversation, and a man who did not resist. Reverend Clement was taken away just after 7. Mrs. Clement stood by the gate, her face pale, her hands steady. She didn't cry. She simply watched the car disappear down the lane. Miss Marple waited beside her, an umbrella in one hand, her handbag in the other. When the motor car vanished, she spoke softly. "He told the truth, at least." Mrs. Clement nodded. "Yes, that's something." They walked back toward the house. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and coal smoke. Inside, the fire was dying. A kettle sat on the stove, half full, its lid rattling gently. Mrs. Clement moved to pour the tea. Her hand trembled, but she didn't spill. "I keep wondering," she said quietly, How long he carried it. The fear. Miss Marple took the cup. As long as it takes for guilt to sound like conscience, she said. Mrs. Clement Saturday. He wasn't evil, Jane. He only wanted to protect people, even when he was wrong. Yes, Miss Marple said. Most harm is done by good intentions, tidied too neatly. The clock chimed 9. Outside, the bell from the church tower answered slow, heavy notes rolling through the rain. Neither woman spoke until the sound faded. Finally, Mrs. Clement whispered, "I can't bear that the village will talk." "They will," said Miss Marple gently. "But they'll tire of it. Gossip grows loud, and then forgets its own tune." The vicar's wife looked down. "What will happen to him?" "He'll face his conscience first," Miss Marple said. "And the law second." Mrs. Clement's voice broke. "I prayed for mercy." Miss Marple reached over, touched her hand lightly. "Mercy," she said, "doesn't always arrive as forgiveness. Sometimes it comes as understanding." The room fell silent again. Steam rose softly from the cups. Miss Marple watched it drift upward and vanish. People, she thought, were much the same. Brief, fragile, and always pretending to be. Steady. She stood to leave. Mrs. Clement followed her to the door. "Will you speak to the inspector?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I'll tell him not all sins belong in ledgers." Outside, the rain had lightened. Drops fell from the eaves in slow rhythm. Across the lane, the church bell began again 3 short tolls. No more. Miss Marple paused by the gate. Her umbrella caught the wind, tilting slightly. She closed it, looked up at the dull grey sky. "Strange," she murmured, "how mercy always sounds quieter than justice." Then she turned toward home, and the rain followed her down the road. A week passed. The rain was gone. The village smelled of soap, trimmed hedges, and quiet routines returning. At Gossington Hall, the garden had reopened for tea. The chairs stood out again, neat and welcoming. No one spoke of letters or deaths anymore, at least. Not loudly. Mrs. Bantry poured the tea with new precision. Her hands no longer trembled. "Strange how things settle," she said. "One would think the village had forgotten entirely." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villages never forget, my dear. They just change the subject." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "I suppose you're right. Still, I do wish people would stop asking about the vicar. The poor man was weak, not wicked." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "Few people understand the difference. Weakness only stumbles. Wickedness plans ahead." The maid passed with a tray of scones. The scent of warm butter filled the air. Even the small comforts, Miss Marple thought, had their purpose. They reminded people that life continued, no matter how badly it behaved. Lady Bantry stirred her tea. "Mrs. Clement has gone to her sister's, I hear." "Yes," said Miss Marple. She needed a change of air. Grief travels slowly when there's duty to pack. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of bees near the window. Then Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Do you ever tire of being right, Jane?" Miss Marple looked amused. "Goodness, no. I'm only ever partly right. Human nature takes care of the rest." Mrs. Bantry smiled despite herself. "I sometimes think you see through people." "Not through," said Miss Marple gently. "Just around the edges. That's where truth hides when it feels shy." From the lane outside came the sound of a bicycle bell, light and cheerful. Children's laughter followed, quick and bright. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary peace. Mrs. Bantry poured another cup. "I can't help thinking," she said. "It might all happen again. Somewhere. Another letter. Another whisper." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course it will. People never change as much as they pretend." The wind brushed the curtains softly. The afternoon sun spilled through, catching the silver on the teapot. Miss Marple watched the light dance and fade. "Trouble," she said quietly, "always looks new. But it's the same shape each time. Only the names differ." Mrs. Bantry reached for a scone. "I'll never understand how you can be so calm after all this." "Because," Miss Marple said, "the world insists on repeating itself. Once you accept that, you stop expecting improvement." The clock chimed 4. Teacups clinked. A bee hovered, then escaped back to the garden. Mrs. Bantry smiled faintly. Well then, back to normal. Yes, said Miss Marple. Normal enough. She gathered her knitting, stood, and looked toward the green. Human nature, she murmured, doesn't change so very much. And as always, she said it without judgment, only quiet understanding. Davis's voice returns. Soft, calm, familiar. So, which clue betrayed the truth this time? Was it the ink stain, the warmth of the pot, or the letter that refused to stay burned? He pauses, letting the question linger. The letter found in the teapot of Miss Marple. Mystery. A faint sound of a kettle begins to rise. He speaks again, lower now. Next time, a mirror with no reflection, and a secret that stares back. Then, the ritual line gentle, certain. Tomorrow, another kettle will boil.